So we'll begin this session on private equity's role in water supply. And I'll ask each member of the panel to introduce themselves and say what you do and what your company does in this space. And then I've got some questions. I started out addressing the questions to particular members of the panel, but you should all free to jump in as appropriate. But first, tell us about yourselves.
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Oh, perfect. Okay. My name's Rob Sim. I'm a senior vice president in Stantec's water group. Stantec is a large engineering, architecture, and science company. We participate, we're a global company. We participate in the private equity space from the perspective of we're either an owner's engineer for municipalities or industries that want to have a private equity funded project, or more and more we work with folks like Michael Earlbeck and Kyle Gronowski who do private equity funded projects, and we help them with their due diligence and some of their technical expertise requirements.
The real diehards here shortly after lunch, so they didn't let us bring coffee in, so I'm hurting just the way you are too. Michael Earlbeck, I do business development for EPCOR. Spent the first half of my career, 16 years with the Bureau of Reclamation, doing policy work and planning in the West. And then the last 17 years I've been in the private sector, really developing projects with private capital. So EPCOR is an owner-operator, so we finance, develop, own, and operate water infrastructure. We don't design build. We bring in experts to do that for us, but we are that long-term owner and self-performing operator of a lot of the projects we build.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jessica Fox. I'm the Southwest Regional Director with Westwater Research. And thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be on the panel with all of you today. Westwater is a water resource economics consulting firm, and we specialize in valuation and value of water rights across the West. And the role that we typically play when it comes to private equity is usually in either deal sourcing, looking for potential private equity investments in water rights, water assets, or on the due diligence side, where we help identify the physical and legal and regulatory risks around water rights or physical water assets. Thank you.
Hi. Good afternoon. Kyle Gronowski here. I'm the president of R3 Sustainability. My personal background has been in infrastructure finance, everything from tolled infrastructure like roads and bridges to things like landfills and microgrid energy, and founded R3 to take some of the learnings of those other areas and bring it to water. R3 invests in sustainable infrastructure, develops and invests in sustainable infrastructure primarily across the water, energy, and waste valorization markets. Today, we are currently in various stages of development, about 1.5 billion in infrastructure assets across the US and Canada, and look forward to chatting on this panel.
Quick follow-up, where are you physically based?
Based here in Phoenix, Arizona.
Based out of Austin, Texas.
I'm also here in Phoenix.
And I'm in Denver, Colorado.
The question I wanted to ask, and I was directing it to Rob and Michael, but others jump in, is can you give some successful examples of P3 partnership? And what was the key to making them work? And what are changes that would need to occur to make things work that don't work well now?
Okay. So maybe I'll start. Two projects like right off the top. One is the water project, the project that we're doing right now in Taylor, Texas for Samsung. We're working with EPCOR. It's water and wastewater supply for semiconductor manufacturing facility, and that's a project location where small city in Texas, 17,000 folks, They didn't have the capabilities to build that kind of infrastructure. And now we're working directly for Samsung. And that's a private equity funded project. And then Vista Ridge, which I'm going to let Mike talk about. He was the original project developer with that. And that's a water supply project in Texas. And Mike, we want to talk about that one.
Sure. Vista Ridge is a big groundwater project. It's 142 miles of 60-inch pipe delivering fresh water to San Antonio, Texas. $978 million back in 2018. So a large P3 project for the city there. EPCOR is one of the owners and now the operator of that facility. So we deliver 44.5 million gallons a day to San Antonio, and they're asking us to bring more water through the pipeline. They wish they'd have built it bigger. Yeah.
I'll just add, I think Glenn in an earlier panel suggested that private equity does not need to necessarily mean P3. And I think a lot of projects in other sectors have seen success by getting rid of that nomenclature and allowing just more just private. And perhaps we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, with regard to what works, what doesn't work, if you look at the amount of new water and wastewater infrastructure that everyone says needs to be built in the U.S., particularly in the West, and why it's not getting built, it's not because we don't have technology. There's very few of our water problems that we don't have the technology right now off the shelf to build, own, and operate. It's not that we don't have funding. It may not be public debt, but there's certainly a lot of private capital that would love to compete for lowest rates to get into a project. It really is deal flow, and that is because cities are not willing right now to sign contracts to commit to pay for water that's going to be delivered. All of the projects we're talking about as successes in private financing of water infrastructure, without exception, every single one of those customers agreed and committed to pay for water that is more expensive than what they're currently paying. In some cases, substantially more expensive. San Antonio had to raise rates citywide by 18% to do the Vista Ridge deal. And without that understanding that all of the fresh water that's close to our communities has been developed. Our next generation of water supplies is going to be of poorer quality. It's going to require more treatment, and we're going to have to go farther to bring it to where we need it. And it's just going to cost more than what our current water rates are priced at. It's the cities that understand that and stretch. They're the ones that are going to be able to secure new supply and continue to grow.
Can I just, you mentioned something, it's not just the willingness to pay a higher price than you're used to paying or than you paid in the past. It's making a long-term commitment. Now, I've spent 5 years looking at San Diego County and probably 25 years looking at Metropolitan. San Diego County has 26 member agencies, Metropolitan around 100 or 50, but then behind that there's one. And what happens there is the member agencies don't want to make commitments. They don't want, I actually wrote a report in 1990 for Met saying they should have take-or-pay contracts with the member agencies. And so the individual water systems like the flexibility. I'm not making a commitment. January or whatever, you'll tell me what you charge for 2026, and then I'll decide how much water I want to take from you in 2026. And 2027, I can do something different. And so it's partly a culture, but given the capital intensity of water supplies, it's sort of continuing to do stuff without long-term commitments of the provider.
You can't press a button and get water, though.
Yes.
Right? That's the problem.
And the question is how to develop more of a culture or willingness to make long-term commitments, you know, in the context of a $600 billion investment backlog or climate change. Has any, so in San Antonio, the water department, maybe the city saw it that way. Could state level government provide leadership or need to kind of nudge this change?
Yeah, absolutely. It really is a shift. I'm a business development person, when we're looking, talking to potential customers, I tend to try to put them in one of three categories very quickly because I can only work with one of the categories. The first question I'm going in my mind is, do they realize that they have a problem, or are they still waiting for it to rain and snow? Right? Because we have built 80% of all of our surface water storage in the West in a single generation from 1950 to 1990, and we've largely stopped building new water supply for the last 35 years. And during that same period of time, the population in the West has doubled. It's not a matter of whether it needs to rain more or not. We are basically asking more and more of our surface water systems to perform without increasing its capacity, but adding more and more and more users. And so the first question is, do they realize that they have a problem? Are they still waiting for it to rain? If yeah, these are the people that understand we have to actually go get new supply. Are they looking for Washington, D.C., or maybe the state to take the lead in planning, designing, and building new, large, centralized water projects? Because we haven't done that for 4 decades at a government level. It's that third category. Yeah, we have to do something, and I'm not sure government's going to build the next generation of water supplies. What are our options? That's really the group that private capital can help, because until you recognize there's a problem, and it's probably not going to come through public funding, they'll have some money to do, but we're not going to see another Bureau of Reclamation build, 100 dams in 40 years in the West. We're just not going to see it.
Add anything, Ken?
Well, what I would add to that is I think that's why what we're seeing today in private capital in waters, it's driven by industry, right? Because industry knows they're looking forward, they're seeing how they plan to grow, and they're realizing that there's a shortfall, and therefore they're figuring out ways to invest into that. I don't know when states take that sort of approach, but that's what would be required to get private capital more involved.
Jessica, so Westwater is probably the leading water broker in covering the West. Now, if you look at the aggregate data on water markets, they're primarily short-term leases of various sorts, or maybe multi-year leases, but not permanent transfers. The question is, what does it take for a municipality to have confidence in some form, maybe a multi-year lease, as a supply source, as opposed to the sort of conventional model where it buys water rights or it buys land plus water rights?
I think a lot of what drives the answer to that, in my experience in Arizona, is compliance with regulations. The municipal growth in Arizona, as you know, has to secure a 100-year long-term water supply. And so if there are opportunities for short-term or medium-term leases, that's excellent, but those leases are going to be evaluated, annualized over that 100-year period. So in effect, you're maybe not securing as much water as you need to support the growth and economic development in your community. So in Arizona, at least, I feel the prospect of finding a long-term permanent supply, annually renewable supply, has been the path that's much more interesting and useful and necessary for municipal growth. But then you have entities like the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District, who is charged with finding water supplies to meet their membership's demand to replenish groundwater that's pumped up front. The nature of how they can take and utilize water allows them to engage in more flexible water supply agreements, such as pursuing rotational fallowing, which there was an effort by the Central Arizona Groundwater District to pursue that. They have the capacity to explore different types of supplies because they're not putting water in the taps every day. So I think there's that difference in what is and as has been mentioned from the industrial side, there can be more of an appetite for kind of decentralized access to supplies that are less reliable or shorter term. And so I think on the municipal side, it's really, thinking about consumer protection and reliable long-term supplies that drive that interest more toward permanent transfers.
You know, if you look at Metropolitan Water District, the wholesale supplier to Southern California, what's changed over 30 years? Two things. It created a massive reservoir, 800,000 acre feet on the east side, but it also started storing water behind Lake Mead and in the Kern groundwater bank and whatever. So if you have storage, and this is really what it built with the reservoir and what it put together with the agreements since 1990, if you have storage, you can pick up water in wet years under kind of seasonal leasing, but it becomes part of the seasonal supply because you've got the storage. Do we need in Arizona, or do we have, where do we get the storage? That's one part of the question. The other thing is if you compare water with electricity, the conveyance, the transmission of electricity, you have common carriers, you know, with pipeline for oil pipelines or electrons. With water, the aqueducts that exist typically are owned by a particular entity that owns the water, and the aqueduct is used for its water, but it's not a common carrier. You know, is there some space for somebody to provide storage and to provide conveyance who's not necessarily, you know, who's in the business or has the goal of providing storage and conveyance rather than owning water? Do you see something like that?
Yeah, I'll take a leap. I think there is in that space if you have a customer with an offtake contract, right? Water infrastructure, particularly water supply infrastructure, nobody builds a merchant plant. You don't build it hoping someday that you might sell some water out of it. In order to finance that infrastructure, you've got to have customers on the back end already agreeing to pay it. That's how you attract the private debt and equity to build it.
Be similar to an irrigation district, right? Irrigation district basically operates the conveyance and the pumpings and all of that, but they get the farmers pay a fee.
And so in California, and I think here in Arizona, they own the water. With ditch companies in Colorado, the water users who hold the shares own the water. So the major issue, I think, is that's looming is supply augmentation, supply shortage. You mentioned the San Antonio as an example of a private equity involvement on the supply side. Do you see, you know, how can that be expanded, and how can it be expanded to the municipal sector, which is 85% of urban water supply?
Do you want me to start? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
If not exactly understanding the context of the question, but what I would say is going back to the more industrial side of things, it's quite astonishing with how much water industrials use, and taking some of that supply off. To Michael's point, with a long-term agreement, contract, et cetera, can actually dramatically help the municipalities to service a growing population, for example. And that's where we see opportunity. I think it can grow in lots of places in the country. And it's actually bringing more supply to the population by reusing water, for example, on site for a customer, rather than putting it back into the system in a different format.
Okay. So you asked specifically about source of water into the state of Arizona. And so we're, as you know, with us doing this solicitation, we've been looking at that, and we've been developing schemes with for new sources into the state. And without giving away details, you know, of what those schemes are, because it's a competitive situation, but I can tell you that, you know, the fact that you've got water rights on the Colorado River water, you've got folks that have access to the Central Arizona project, what you do is you look at, can I go to people or entities that have water rights? I basically create a water supply for them in exchange for the rights they already have. And then there's a paper water transfer where I basically wheel that water, to the new user. And in my mind, the deal, that's where the deal point. A lot of people think that the water problem in Arizona is going to be solved by technology and other things. I think it's going to be solved by creating the win-win and having the right deal structure is what's going to help solve that problem. I think you want to minimize the amount of infrastructure that you build, but because there's traded water rights, I think there's an opportunity, certainly, for paper exchanges. Obviously, there's legalities that go with that, but that's all part and parcel of the way that'll be solved.
You know, one of the questions I've wondered about with Arizona, the water infrastructure solicitation, is who would sign the contract? Would it be, particular cities, Phoenix, whatever? Or might it be the authority? And let me say, the reason I'm asking this question is I've been working for San Diego County. They are delivering, the county is a wholesaler to 3 million people. They are delivering 42% less water than in 2009 over 12, 13 years because of conservation, now because of pure water. 85%, they're a wholesaler, 85% of their costs are fixed cost. Suddenly delivering less water is bankrupting them. And so part of the game, thinking of this sort of as an academic, I think risk pooling. Different people will have different sources of water. You'll have different degrees of conservation. If I were investing in an expensive source, whether it's desal, or the QSA, I'd like to share the risk. And if an individual city does it, it kind of doesn't have as broad risk sharing as if it's some sort of consortium.
Okay, so these guys will get into the risk part, and I agree you want to share the risk, but also when you're doing any of these projects, you want to look at multiple revenue sources. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. We're looking at potential desal project with a battery supplier that is looking at making sodium ion batteries. Okay, and we're talking to them about what is the opportunity to co-locate those facilities because we have a sodium source, right? And so that's one of the things that I think that private equity brings to the table. A lot of people think that all the private equity is finance. Private equity is finance plus expertise. And that expertise, a lot of it is how do you create the right business deal to make that project go forward? And so it's more than just pooling the risk. These guys know more about risk than I'm sure than I do, but it's also what can you do on the revenue side?
Well, I was just going to add to your example on the 80% of costs being fixed. I don't know the exact details of that area, but perhaps that's a situation where 40 years of underinvestment has resulted in a area that's no longer viable. Perhaps you need more investment there under a different format. I don't know what that is, but
no. What actually happened is they signed take-or-pay contracts for desal and for water from the Colorado River, the QS. And they're selling so much less water now. And the cost of water is a fixed cost because they have a take-or-pay contract. And so, it was a prudent thing to do 20 years ago because who knew, how demand would change. But on the other hand, you can't get major contracts without a commitment. And so the problem is balancing sort of the degree of commitment with a degree of flexibility.
Yeah, for a wholesaler to commit to take or pay contracts and then not roll that same risk down to its retail customers, then yeah, you've exposed yourself to exactly that risk. Water conservation is a good strategy. It's good stewardship, but it is not new water supply. There's a lot of cities that had the choice to go do an expensive new water supply project or just implement conservation. And they've told the ratepayers that we're going to do conservation because that way we want to raise rates. Well, they're very good at conservation. They put themselves in the situation where they're selling less water, but their fixed costs are the same and they still have to raise rates. And water conservation only solves your problem if you stop growing. If you don't stop growing, then what it does is it buys you time from when you actually have to go secure that new water supply. And if you get very good at water conservation, that could be decades. And now your problem is all of the water supplies that were close and cost effective, they're all already off the table because while you were doing water conservation, other people were actually securing new supplies. So now you actually have to come to market for new supply and the options are really limited. So water conservation is a good tool in the toolbox, but I don't know how many cities have gotten themselves 20, 30 years behind by being very good at water conservation because now they actually need, like San Antonio, they needed new water to grow and they had to go 142 miles to find available supply.
I mean, so one thing which is also an issue in Southern California is potable reuse, direct, advanced treatment. My impression is it's being done in those places not as a source of water supply, but because the wastewater treatment system is, and the sewers are overloaded. And this way, you extend the capacity, in effect, of the system. But you get another revenue source, right? If you, in the sense of, and it depends how much you make the wastewater bill pick up that cost as opposed to the water supply bill. And in many cases, wastewater is a completely different agency. It's the county in California. Often it's the county, it's not the water agency. So this, but if that in the California context, and maybe here, if you could bridge that gap so that you can identify really a wastewater treatment source of revenue, which is part of the, it's both a source of water supply, but it's also a saving on wastewater. I mean, have you run into those possibilities and what do you think of them for the future?
So we are the program manager for the Pure Water program in San Diego. And the premise of that project is indirect potable reuse. It becomes basically the source for the water treatment. I can tell you in Arizona, we have clients. We have one I can't remember the name of the district, but we have one east of the city that the wastewater utility is separate from the water utility because it's a private water utility. And we've encouraged the client to coordinate with the water utility because the wastewater, they don't have, when you look at their water plan, they don't have enough water to support the growth going forward. And so we have set them on the path towards direct potable reuse because that's going to be the water source for them to be able to meet their growth requirements. And that's not a nice to have, it's a necessity if they want to stick to their growth requirements.
We're working with a municipality in the Midwest that they want more industry to come in, and water is the issue. And so we're looking at doing a industrial reuse off the tail end of the wastewater treatment plant, and then piping that water 8.5 miles to an industrial park. What that does for the municipality is it gives them that additional revenue source, as just mentioned, but also allows them to open up water that they had earmarked for that industrial area for population growth that's coming as well. And those are the types of projects where I do believe that reuse can heavily advantage a municipality. That is a very forward-thinking municipality, I'll say, though, right? And so it takes a lot of that sort of mentality to do projects like that.
So in this session before lunch, San Francisco's water manager talked about, they adopted an ordinance, and I think she said in 2012, to foster decentralized waters. So new projects would be encouraged to go for non-potable reuse and non-potable. Is that common? Is that sort of, what is it, how, because then you could work with the developers of the particular apartment buildings or, you know, factory complex or shopping malls or whatever to do that. Is that sort of becoming common, or is that on the other hand sort of opposed by many large municipal systems? What's the state of play?
I would say on that scale that you mentioned, it's incredibly difficult to make the economics work, simply because we're talking very small amount of gallons or, you know, customer base to attribute the CapEx to, and the operations, right? So if I think more adoption is beneficial, but it needs to be done in a way that you should understand that we need scale. It can't just be adoption on very small units.
I can tell you that what we're seeing on the private equity side in terms of decentralized, it's typically industry that the utility or the municipality can't get water to them in a timely manner relative to their schedule, build schedule. And Kyle and I are working on something right now in Texas that it's a industrial park, and they're going to do a brackish groundwater supply there because, and it's going to be private equity funded if it goes ahead, because the utilities just can't supply it.
See, the way I'm thinking of big cities, water systems, you know, developed in 1900, you know, in the 19th century, you know, essentially all there for over 100 years, falling behind in maintenance. There's a big widespread system. There's a big backlog. It will cost someday a ton of money to fix the distribution system. Where is the money going to come from? And sort of how do you get, could some form of decentralization play a role in that? So if you were building a new industrial park today or whatever, and you know it's a virgin territory, you can do whatever you want. But what happens to these kind of stranded dinosaurs with distribution systems that are, you know, 120 years old and under-maintained?
So I'm not sure I'd look at it that way.
Being charitable.
Yeah. There's another way to look at it. EPCOR, I'm going to give you an example of Edmonton, Canada. Okay. EPCOR is a private company that spun off from the city of Edmonton, and the stormwater utility drainage was being run by the city. And basically, EPCOR negotiated with the city. They then looked at the stormwater utility, and they brought the management expertise to the table. And they basically, they purchased that, and they developed a CIP program to rehabilitate the infrastructure. And I'm pretty sure that included a revised financial model and revised rates and everything else. And that's a way for the private sector to participate in that, as opposed to trying to do decentralized systems, is bringing in somebody that has the expertise to basically rehabilitate that system.
Is it easier to do that in Canada than in the United States?
I don't know if it's easier, but to answer your question, it'll be the ratepayers. In the end, the ratepayers, right? The reason they just don't know it's them, because their rates, most rates in the US, probably most rates in Canada, are based on simply covering the O&M, because all of the supply CapEx was done by state and federal governments decades ago, and it's all been fully repaid. So our rates are just covering O&M. There's no sinking fund to replace the supply that we have or to replace the infrastructure, to replace the distribution. There's certainly not a sinking fund in my rate to go secure new supply. I was on a panel last year in Texas and 300 or 400 people in the room, and somebody stood up and said, aren't you concerned about how expensive municipal water is getting for new supply? And honestly, I chuckled out loud, and so I felt I needed to explain myself. And I said, I think it's cute that you think it's expensive. Like, it's not expensive yet, because right now cities are just competing with cities for the limited supply options that are on the table. Wait until the tech space enters that market and you have semiconductors and data centers taking water positions 10, 20, 50 MGD off the table with a check and writing the landowners or those water rights holders 3, 4, 5 times what the city was offering. See, now you're going to see expensive water, because cities are going to have to compete with tech, who understand now that the key to growth and key to siting is securing water and energy. And they don't have a problem paying for that up front. And we're starting to see that now in the Texas market.
Jessica, can I ask you, because Westwater covers Colorado, Big Thompson, and you want to say something about what the prices of water in that market have gone up to?
Oh, now you're asking me to know the price of water in another
Well,
state. And I can't say that with certainty.
$90,000 an acre foot a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I think it's
Down
pushing.
to 70, 75.
Yeah, over $50,000. It's all relative, right? I mean, what you're getting out of the supply and the reliability and all that is a factor. I wanted to mention, because of something Michael just said too, about competition for supplies and competing with other cities or other municipalities. It's interesting that this is entering kind of the policy debate, or has been here in Arizona, that the restrictions on municipal water suppliers, private utilities or public, in their inability to use groundwater over the long term unless it's replenished, that has left the groundwater rights space open to industrial users. So that's becoming a real point of contention in Arizona, that the water rights market, groundwater rights market in central Arizona, at least in the past few years, is dominated by industrial water users who might only plan to, maybe they have a 30-year horizon for their facility, but they are allowed to utilize groundwater without replenishing it. And that's not sitting well with the municipalities and the home builders who are charged with competing for supplies, which typically is not groundwater, it's other water rights, and they have to pay for replenishment, or if they do use local groundwater. And so it's creating a real divergence in who has access to what types of water and what the price is.
And the Colorado market in the Front Range north of Denver, where the prices went from about $10,000 in 2009 to 70, then 90, but still in the 70s today, is not cities, but housing developers competing with one another. And what's happened there is, in 1960, farmers owned 86% of the water rights. And now they own something like 28%. And the amount of agricultural rights is coming on the market, let's say, in the next 10, 15 years, is not going to go down to zero. Maybe farming will go down to 20%. So it's a little like a mining play about to play out. And so if you're a housing developer and you want to buy up water, pay $90,000 if that's what it takes, because 10 years from now, you can't get it. What about one thing that I want to come back to, this whole business of, if I'm a city and I work with private equity, it wants, a higher interest rate than I pay on tax-free municipal debt, and that worries me. So the point is, there's a limited capacity to raise municipal debt for water and wastewater. What drove the privatization of the UK industry was lack of access to capital. It was all funded by the national government, and it couldn't raise the capex that was needed, and that's why it was privatized. Now, the management of capital raising after privatization has been less than perfect. But we essentially, if we have a $600 billion backlog of investment, which will grow to $1 billion, we're in the same position as, you know, water in England and Wales?
I'll take a shot at that. So I guess my answer to that is cheap money can be really expensive to get. Part of the reason why if a city who floats public debt, bond issuers are going to issue that at essentially at a no risk rate, right? And the reason they're doing that is because that project that you're going to build with that money, it doesn't have to actually ever produce a single drop of water. That bond issuer is going to get repaid 100% of everything they're loaning to you. That's why there's no performance risk in the cost of debt, because those ratepayers are going to have to pay that back regardless of whether that project ever is successful. So when you look at a private sector coming in, doing the same thing under a performance-based take-or-pay contract, the only way we get our money back is if it actually performs. If it doesn't make water available that day, we don't get paid that day. And so we have in our cost of capital all of the project performance risk over a 30-year period. And so that's really the difference in the cost of capital. Public debt has zero project performance risk in it. And what I've never seen a city do is when you go to council with a proposal and you say, okay, we want approval to do this project, it's going to cost this much. And so our principal and interest payment's going to be this, and then we're going to add on top what we think it's going to cost to O&M. So that's our total monthly payment. Do we get approval? And council says, yes, go do it. 5 years later, come back and do a postmortem on that project and say, what's my total monthly bill for this project now that it's under operations? Well, the design build went over 30%, so we actually have more interest because we had to borrow more. And the O&M is using more chemicals, a little bit more power. And so, you know, it's taking that total payment and backing it back into what was actually the cost of public debt, right? The effective cost of public debt, because what they approved by the time you're in it, because if you use public debt, that owner, those ratepayers own that project and they own all that performance risk. But cities, once they get the vote to fund it and move forward, rarely do they go back and actually do an evaluation side by side and to say, are we able to execute and own and operate a facility like this over the long term at a way that saves our ratepayers money compared to what the private sector can do? Because when they sign a contract with the private sector, their price is fixed, and whatever happens for the next 30 years, their number doesn't go up. And so it's really that cost comparison. An academic should do a graduate study paper on that. That would be great.
But Michael, it's more than just everybody talks about interest rates, and when you look at what private equity can do for you for your project, you got to look at the expertise. I'm going to just give you an example of a project that we worked on with EPCOR. It was a mine impacted water project. It was about 20 years ago for the province of British Columbia in Canada. It was the second most contaminated site in North America at the time. And they put out a performance RFP for a public-private partnership. And the way that project was structured was basically the performance. If we didn't meet the effluent criteria for the month, we lost the capital portion of our payment, or capital recovery portion for that month. It was a fairly significant impetus for us to perform. I think we're at the end of that contract now. Pretty close is my recollection, and we spent an inordinate amount of time on how do we optimize that project. We put in at the time it was novel to put in a micro turbine at the outfall to basically reduce our energy costs. We did a number of different things. One of the questions that when we did the prep for this, you asked, what is the key to a successful public-private partnership? Certainly in my mind, one of the keys is to have an RFP that's structured based upon outcomes and to allow for the creativity that I think the private sector can bring to these projects.
We've run out of our time, but thank you. Thank the panelists for a really interesting discussion. Thank you.